There is a fire burning in the Middle East right now. You know that. You have been watching it. You have been feeling the anxiety of it in your chest every time you open the news. Iran and Israel, missiles and air defenses, and the terrifying question of what comes next. But here's what I want to talk to you about tonight, because I think this particular piece of the story is not getting nearly enough attention, and that is what is happening on the other side of the world, in Beijing, where China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi just stepped in front of a microphone and said something that every single person watching this conflict needs to hear and understand. Because when Wang Yi speaks about a crisis of this magnitude, he is not just one more voice in the chorus of international reaction. He is speaking for the second most powerful nation on earth. He is speaking for a country that has its own deep strategic and economic equities in the Middle East. He is speaking for a government that has been quietly and very deliberately positioning itself as an alternative to American leadership in the region for years. And what he just said tells you a great deal about where this war is headed and what the world's most powerful players are actually prepared to do about it. I'm Rachel Maddow, and this is USA News. Stay with me, because tonight we are going to go deep. We are going to go beyond the missiles and the air raid sirens and the breaking news tickers, and we are going to understand the larger geopolitical architecture that surrounds this conflict, and specifically the role that China is playing, wants to play, and is positioning itself to play in determining how this ends. To help us think through all of that, I also want to bring in the perspective of Professor Jiang Xueqin, a scholar whose work on Chinese foreign policy and Chinese strategic thinking in the Middle East is some of the most rigorous and illuminating analysis available right now. His framework for understanding Beijing's behavior in moments like this is going to be incredibly useful as we work through what Wang Yi just said and what it actually means. So let's start with the statement itself. What did Wang Yi say? The Chinese foreign minister released a formal statement. And let me be clear, in Chinese diplomatic culture, a formal statement from the foreign minister is never an accident, never improvised, never casual. Every word is chosen, every phrase is deliberate, every rhetorical choice is the product of consultation and calculation at the highest levels of the Chinese Communist Party. So when Wang Yi says something, you do not just listen to the surface of the words. You think about the architecture underneath them. You think about what they are designed to accomplish, what audience they are playing to, and what they reveal about Beijing's actual strategic posture. Wang Yi called for an immediate ceasefire. He called for de-escalation. He said China opposes any actions that expand the scope of the conflict. He affirmed China's commitment to regional stability and the sovereignty of all nations. He called for the resumption of diplomatic channels and expressed China's willingness to play a constructive role in any multilateral effort to bring the conflict to a halt. Now, on the surface of it, that sounds like the kind of statement any responsible major power would make. Reasonable, measured, pro-peace. And there is a temptation, especially in American media, to hear language like that and dismiss it as empty diplomatic boilerplate. The kind of thing countries say when they want to appear responsible without actually doing anything. But I want to push back on that dismissal hard, because I think it misreads both China's intentions and China's capabilities in this moment, and Professor Jiang Xueqin's work helps us understand exactly why. Jiang's core argument, and I find it genuinely persuasive, is that China's approach to the Middle East over the last decade has not been passive. It has not been simply reactive. It has been a carefully choreographed long game designed to insert China into the region's most important relationships in ways that give Beijing leverage, influence, and options that it simply did not have 20 years ago. The crown jewel of that effort, the moment that announced China's arrival as a genuine diplomatic player in the Middle East in a way that stunned Washington, was the Chinese brokered normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran in March of 2023. That deal, which established diplomatic relations between two countries that had been bitter enemies for years, was brokered not in Geneva, not in Washington, not in London, but in Beijing, under Chinese auspices, with Chinese guarantees. And it sent a message that reverberated through every foreign ministry in the world. China is not just an economic presence in the Middle East anymore. China is a diplomatic player. China can do things that America cannot or will not do. And now, with Iran and Israel in direct military confrontation, with missiles flying and bases burning and the entire regional order teetering on the edge, Wang Yi's statement has to be understood in the context of that track record. China is not just commenting on this conflict from the sidelines. China has relationships with actors on multiple sides of this crisis that give it a form of access and influence that no other external power possesses. China has deep economic and energy relationships with Iran. China has growing trade and investment ties with Israel. China has its massive Belt and Road relationships with the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, who are caught in the terrifying middle of an escalating conflict between two of the region's most powerful military forces. Wang Yi's call for a ceasefire is not just words, it is a signal. It is Beijing saying, we are here, we have relationships with the relevant parties, and we are prepared to use those relationships if the conditions are right. The question, and this is the question that Professor Jiang Xueqin would push us to ask, is whether Beijing's conditions for deeper engagement align with a genuine path to de-escalation, or whether they align primarily with China's own strategic interests in ways that may not actually resolve the conflict but simply reshape it to Beijing's advantage. Let me be direct about what China's strategic interests in this crisis actually are, because I think that clarity is essential and sometimes gets lost in the idealistic language of multilateralism and diplomacy. China imports enormous quantities of oil from the Middle East. The stability of the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz is not an abstraction for Beijing. It is the economic lifeline that fuels Chinese industrial production. Any conflict that disrupts oil flows from the region is a direct threat to Chinese economic stability. So China has a powerful, immediate, self-interested reason to want this war to stop. Not because China is altruistic, not because Beijing has a deep ideological commitment to peace, but because a regional war in the Middle East threatens to blow up the energy supply chain that keeps the Chinese economy running. That is interest number one. Interest number two is more long-term and more strategic. China has spent a decade building influence in the Middle East, specifically as a counterweight to American dominance in the region. Every time the United States stumbles in the Middle East, every time an American-backed peace process collapses, every time American credibility takes a hit, every time the nations of the region look at Washington and wonder if American commitment to regional stability is real, China benefits. Chinese influence expands into the vacuum. If this conflict escalates into a full-scale regional war, and the United States is seen either as complicit in the devastation or as helpless to stop it, that is a win for Beijing's long-term project of positioning itself as the alternative great power for the nations of the global south and the developing world. But, and this is the crucial but, China also does not want the kind of catastrophic instability that a true regional war would produce. A Middle East in flames, with nuclear threshold powers in direct conflict, with oil infrastructure destroyed, with refugee flows destabilizing neighboring countries, with the global financial system convulsed by energy price spikes. That is not the kind of chaos that benefits China. China is a status quo power in the deepest sense. It wants to reshape the hierarchy of the international order. Yes, it wants more influence, more deference, more respect. But it wants those things within a framework of relative stability, relative predictability, relative order. Total chaos serves nobody, and Beijing knows it. So Wang Yi's statement is Beijing threading a very specific needle. It is China saying, we want this to stop, we have the relationships to help make it stop, and we want to be at the center of whatever diplomatic process emerges. But it is also China being very careful not to condemn Iran explicitly, not to say anything that would jeopardize the deep energy and economic relationship with Tehran that has been the foundation of Iranian economic survival under American sanctions. And it is being equally careful not to condemn Israel in a way that would blow up China's significant trade relationships with Tel Aviv and damage China's reputation as a neutral broker. That balancing act is extraordinarily difficult, and Professor Jiang Xueqin's work illuminates something really important about how China tries to pull it off, which is through a form of strategic ambiguity that is designed to preserve optionality. Beijing says enough to be present and relevant. It says enough to be seen as a responsible global power advocating for peace, but it stops well short of the kind of specific, binding commitments that would actually require China to put its relationships at risk to enforce a ceasefire or a diplomatic agreement. The Chinese diplomatic playbook in situations like this is to be loudly present and specifically vague, to project authority without incurring cost. Now, I want to bring this back to what it means for the United States, because that is ultimately the lens through which American audiences need to process this story. The United States and China are the two most powerful nations in the world. They are locked in a strategic competition that spans trade, technology, military posture, and, increasingly, diplomatic influence in the developing world. The Middle East has become one of the key theaters of that competition. And tonight, with Wang Yi at the microphone and the White House Situation Room in full crisis mode, the U.S.-China dimension of this conflict is not background noise. It is front and center. Here is the uncomfortable truth that I think needs to be said plainly. The United States has, for several decades, treated the Middle East as primarily its own sphere of influence. American military power, American diplomatic capital, American economic relationships. These were the primary tools of regional management. The United States brokered peace deals. The United States managed security relationships. The United States maintained the balance of power, for better and for worse, through a combination of military presence, arms sales, economic pressure, and diplomacy. And there were genuine achievements in that model: the Camp David Accords, the Oslo process, the Abraham Accords. But there were also enormous failures: the Iraq War, the inability to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the collapse of the Iran nuclear deal, the rise of ISIS, the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen, the fragmentation of the regional order that had been built up over decades. And as America's credibility in the region has taken hit after hit, China has been filling in the gaps, not with military force. China has no significant military presence in the Middle East and does not want one, but with money, with trade, with investment, with the kind of patient long-term relationship building that Beijing is extraordinarily good at and that American short-term political cycles make very difficult for Washington to replicate. Wang Yi's statement tonight is the latest move in that long game. And the question of how Washington responds, not just to Iran's attack on Israel, but to China's very deliberate positioning of itself as a diplomatic alternative, is one of the most important strategic questions facing the Trump administration right now. Because here's the risk. If the United States responds to this crisis with pure military backing of Israel, with maximum pressure on Iran, with no diplomatic channel and no off-ramp, and if that approach leads to a prolonged regional war with devastating human and economic consequences, China will be there in the aftermath, offering itself as the neutral party, the responsible power, the one that called for de-escalation while America poured fuel on the fire. That is the narrative Beijing is positioning to tell. And in the global south, in the Arab world, in the developing nations that are watching this crisis with deep alarm, that narrative could be devastatingly effective. I want to spend a few minutes on something that I think Professor Jiang Xueqin would push us to consider very carefully, which is the domestic Chinese dimension of Wang Yi's statement, because Chinese foreign policy is never entirely separable from Chinese domestic politics. Xi Jinping is the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. He has consolidated authority in ways that no Chinese leader since the founding of the People's Republic has managed. And his foreign policy is not just about China's place in the world. It is about his own legitimacy at home. It is about the narrative he tells the Chinese people about the kind of country China is becoming under his leadership. A country that is respected, that is listened to, that is taken seriously as a global power, that can do things that America cannot. Wang Yi walking to that microphone tonight and calling for a ceasefire, positioning China as the voice of reason and de-escalation in a conflict that America is deeply enmeshed in, that plays extraordinarily well in Beijing. It plays well with the Chinese public. It plays well with the party apparatus. It plays well with the Global South audience that Xi Jinping has been cultivating through the Belt and Road Initiative and through China's expanding diplomatic and economic footprint. Every time Wang Yi issues a statement like this and it gets covered by international media, including right here, right now on this program, it validates Xi Jinping's argument that China has arrived as a global leader. I'm not saying that to be cynical. I am saying it because understanding the full motivational architecture behind a foreign policy move is essential to evaluating whether that move is likely to produce real results or whether it is primarily performative. And the honest answer in this case is probably both. Wang Yi's statement serves Beijing's domestic and international image, and it may also, in the right circumstances, provide a genuine diplomatic entry point. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. The question is which purpose predominates, and that depends enormously on what China is actually willing to do behind the scenes, in direct conversations with Tehran, with Jerusalem, with Washington, to back up the public rhetoric with real diplomatic work. And that is where the real test comes. The words are easy. The principles, ceasefire, de-escalation, dialogue, sovereignty, are easy to state and hard to oppose. The hard part is the private diplomacy. Does China pick up the phone to Iranian leadership and say, in language that is direct and specific and carries real consequences, that this needs to stop? Does China use its economic leverage, and its economic leverage over Iran is enormous, given that China has been the primary purchaser of Iranian oil under sanctions, to make clear to Tehran that further escalation will come at a cost? Is China willing to put anything real on the line, or is this a moment of strategic theater? I do not have a definitive answer to that question tonight, and I want to be honest with you about that. The private diplomacy that determines the real answer happens in rooms and in conversations that journalists do not have access to. What I can tell you is that the signals coming from people who track this closely, including scholars in Professor Jiang Xueqin's circle, suggests that China's engagement is more substantive than pure theater, but less decisive than genuine mediation. Beijing is talking to Tehran. The conversations are real, the messages being delivered are serious, but China is not yet prepared to threaten Iran with consequences that would truly alter Iranian decision-making. The relationship is too important, the energy dependency too real, the ideological solidarity against American hegemony too embedded in the rhetoric of the bilateral relationship. That gap between serious conversation and decisive leverage is the gap that may determine whether China's diplomatic entry into this crisis produces an actual off-ramp or whether it produces a very impressive-sounding set of press releases while the missiles keep flying. As I watch all of this unfold tonight, Wang Yi at the microphone, the White House in crisis mode, the Israeli Defense Forces assessing their response options, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard calculating the consequences of what they have set in motion, I keep coming back to a fundamental question about the world we are living in right now. We are in a moment when the international order that was built after World War II, the order built on American leadership, on multilateral institutions, on a set of rules and norms that, for all their imperfections, provided a framework for managing great power conflict. That order is under extraordinary stress. It is being challenged from multiple directions simultaneously, and the Middle East right now is the place where all of those challenges are converging at once. The response to that convergence, from Washington, from Beijing, from the capitals of Europe and the Gulf, will tell us an enormous amount about what kind of world we are building. Whether the institutions and the relationships and the diplomatic frameworks that exist can be marshaled to stop this from becoming something far worse than it already is, or whether we are entering a period in which major powers pursue their interests without the restraint that international norms used to impose, and the smaller nations and the ordinary people of the Middle East bear the consequences. Wang Yi's statement is one data point in that larger story. It is China saying, we are here, we want to roll, we have relationships that matter, whether that translates into real de-escalation or simply into Beijing positioning itself advantageously around the wreckage of a war it was unable or unwilling to prevent. That is the question that the next days and weeks will answer, and we are going to be here every step of the way to help you understand the answer as it comes into focus. I'm Rachel Maddow. This is USA News. Please subscribe right now if you are not already. Hit that notification bell, share this video, because the people in your life who care about the world need to be watching and thinking about this too. We will be back with more as this story develops. Thank you for being here. Don't go anywhere.